Story 1. My folks have a cozy vacation cabin out in a quiet little town called Quincy, California. It is nestled on a 2-acre lot, surrounded by thick woods. Growing up, my siblings and I spent countless weekends there as a family. These days, now that we are all grown, it is tough to coordinate our schedules for a family trip. Back when I was just starting to get to know my girlfriend, Sarah, I mentioned the cabin during one of our early dates. I think it was our 5th date, to be exact. Quincy is magical in the fall. The trees explode into vibrant reds, oranges, and yellows. On a whim, I brought up the idea of us spending a weekend there together. Without hesitation, she smiled and said, "Let us do it." 2 days later, we were packing up and getting ready for the 5-hour road trip. I picked her up from her house, and we hit the road. The drive flew by as we chatted about anything and everything, our favorite television shows, funny childhood memories, family stories, you name it. When we needed a break from talking, we listened to podcasts and comedians. It felt like the hours just melted away. When we finally arrived in Quincy, I decided to take a little detour through the quaint town to show Sarah how charming it was. Small shops and local diners lined the streets, giving it a picture-perfect vibe. She loved it. 10 minutes later, we pulled into the driveway of the cabin. There is a small wooden gate at the entrance of the driveway. It is not locked or anything, it is just there to discourage people from wandering onto the property. I got out to open it, and we drove in. My dad hires landscapers to take care of the place during the warmer months, so the yard looked immaculate. Sarah was visibly impressed, which made me feel proud. We arrived just in time for lunch. After unpacking the car, I showed Sarah around the house and turned on the hot tub so it would be ready for later. Then we headed back into town to grab a bite at one of my favorite local spots. After eating, we wandered around the area, taking in the sights. One of the highlights was visiting the Plumas County Museum, where we got to learn a bit about the local history. By the time we left, the sun was starting to set, and the air was getting chilly. It was the perfect excuse to head back to the cabin and relax in the hot tub. The hot tub sits on the back deck under an awning, so it is great even in cold weather. The warm water felt amazing, and we were both completely relaxed. That was, until we heard the crunching of leaves nearby. It sounded like footsteps. At first, we thought it might be a bear, so we scrambled out of the hot tub and ran inside. I turned off all the lights, hoping it would deter whatever animal was out there. I peeked through one of the windows, expecting to see a bear wandering around, but instead, I saw the shadowy figure of a person moving along the side of the house. My heart started racing. I rushed to lock the back door and shut the blinds. I whispered to Sarah to stay quiet. We could hear the footsteps circling the house, eventually stopping at the front door. Then came a knock. A voice called out, "It is the police." I was confused. Why would the police be here? I approached the door and asked through it, "What is going on?" The voice replied, "We got a report of a break-in." That made no sense. The nearest neighbor is about a quarter of a mile away. I hesitated, and the man outside added, "Sir, I need you to open the door." I responded, "I am sorry, but I do not feel comfortable doing that." Something felt off. I decided to peek through the blinds near the front window to see if there was a patrol car out there. The last bit of twilight made it just light enough to see, but there were no police cars, just darkness and trees. I turned to Sarah and whispered, "I do not think that is a real cop." The man knocked again, but this time I called out, "I do not see a police car out there, so I am not opening the door." Silence followed. For a moment, we thought he had left. We stayed in the living room, whispering nervously to each other, when suddenly, heavy footsteps stomped away from the door. That was when it hit me, he had been standing there silently the whole time. I crept back to the window and peeked out, but whoever it was had disappeared into the night. He must have headed off in a direction that led deeper into the woods. The frightening thing about being surrounded by dense forest is that someone could approach the house from literally any angle. There was no way we were stepping foot outside again that night, except for the brief moment I went out to shut off the bubbles in the hot tub. After that, we stayed inside, locked in the bedroom, watching movies until we finally drifted off to sleep. For extra peace of mind, I grabbed my dad's old shotgun from the closet and stashed it under the bed. The next morning, we tried to shake off the events of the previous night and enjoy the day. We went hiking in the Plumas National Forest, taking in the crisp air and stunning views. Afterward, we grabbed lunch at a local diner and then caught a movie at the small theater nearby. When we returned to the cabin that evening, the sun was setting, and the forest was already growing dark. As I pulled onto the driveway, Rose suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream. Startled, I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing as I thought we were about to hit something. "What is it?" I shouted, trying to stay calm. She pointed frantically. "Over there. Someone is walking away from the house." Sure enough, I caught a glimpse of a figure disappearing into the woods. My stomach sank. Rose was panicking, convinced we were being stalked. I did my best to calm her down, saying, "It is okay. We have the gun, and we are leaving tomorrow morning." But truthfully, I was just as unnerved. I parked the car as close to the cabin as I could, and we rushed inside. My first priority was to double-check that every door and window was securely locked. Once I was satisfied the house was secure, we stayed indoors for the rest of the evening, packing our things so we could leave first thing in the morning. Later, we settled into bed after watching another movie, trying to put the unsettling events out of our minds. But just as I was beginning to drift off, I heard a strange noise. It sounded like scraping, an intermittent, grating sound coming from outside. Every few seconds, it would stop, only to start again. I stayed perfectly still, straining to figure out what it could be. My mind immediately went to the worst possibility: the man from before might have returned. When the noise stopped entirely, I slipped quietly out of bed so I would not wake Rose. I crept to the window and barely kinked the blinds open to take a look. My heart nearly stopped. There, on the other side of the glass, was a man staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, letting out a terrified shout. "Jesus Christ!" I yelled, startling Rose awake. I did not waste time explaining. Instead, I grabbed the shotgun from under the bed, checked to make sure it was loaded, and bolted out the back door. Fueled by fear and adrenaline, I fired 3 shots into the air and yelled at the top of my lungs, hoping to scare him off, or anyone else who might be out there. The sound of the gunfire echoed through the trees, and the adrenaline made me feel invincible for a brief moment. When I came back inside, I explained to Rose what had happened. She was understandably shaken, but I reassured her that whoever it was would not be sticking around after that. When the rush of adrenaline faded, the fear crept back in. Every little sound from outside made my heart race. Still, somehow, we managed to make it through the night without any further incidents. The next morning, I called the police to report the whole ordeal. They said they would make a note of it, though I doubted much could be done at that point. Since then, my family and I have returned to the cabin a few times. Thankfully, that man has never shown up again, at least not while we were there. Story 2. I was driving through Colorado late at night, making my way through the quiet town of Tabernash. The clock had just ticked past 1 in the morning, and the roads were completely deserted. Feeling the fatigue creeping in, I decided to pull into a gas station to fuel up and grab a quick snack. Once I was ready, I got back on the road, determined to make it through the winding stretches ahead. Even though the highway was empty, I stuck to the speed limit. It was late, I was tired, and the last thing I needed was to get pulled over for a minor slip-up. I was cruising at about 55 miles per hour when, out of nowhere, I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror. That heart-sinking red and white glow filled the darkness behind me. I glanced at my speedometer to double-check. I was maybe 2 miles per hour over the limit at most. I pulled over to the shoulder, frustrated and confused. I had never been pulled over before, and I took pride in being a careful, law-abiding driver. This felt unnecessary, maybe even wrong. As the vehicle behind me stopped, I caught sight of it. The lights were flashing red and white, but there was something strange about them, no blue light, which I thought was standard for police vehicles. The man who stepped out of the car approached mine, and I rolled down my window cautiously. He greeted me and asked for my license and registration. His tone was calm but firm. Trying to keep my cool, I asked, "Is there a reason you stopped me?" He brushed off my question and said he would explain in a minute. That did not sit right with me. I knew I had not been speeding, swerving, or doing anything else that would justify a stop. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I know I wasn't breaking any laws. None of my lights are out either, so I am not sure why you are pulling me over. I do not think I should hand over my license unless this stop is lawful." Then I noticed something odd about his uniform. He was dressed all in black with a vest that looked somewhat like a police vest, but there was no police insignia on it. The badge pinned to his chest did not say police either, it read Criminal Task Force. My gut was telling me something was off, but I could not be sure yet. He kept insisting on seeing my license and registration, but his whole demeanor made me uneasy. "Are you really a cop?" I finally asked, keeping my tone as steady as I could. He gave a vague reply, "I am with an undercover unit." Then he repeated his demand for my license. I pushed back, asking for his badge number. His response? "I do not have to give you that." My unease grew. From what I knew, officers were required to provide that information during a stop. And those lights, just red and white with no blue, stood out in my mind as another red flag. Then came the moment that made my heart race. He told me to step out of the car. His tone shifted, louder, more forceful. I replied firmly, "I do not feel comfortable getting out of the car unless a supervisor is present." He did not like that. His voice grew sharp as he repeated his command for me to exit the vehicle. "I am not convinced you are a real cop," I said, trying to mask my fear with confidence. "If you are, calling a supervisor should not be an issue." I rolled my window up slightly, putting a barrier between us, but this only seemed to make him angrier. He banged on my window, demanding I open the door. Then he tried the handle, as if he could just let himself in. That was it. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I shoved his hands away from my window, started my car, and threw it into drive. He shouted at me to stop, but I did not look back. My foot hit the gas, and I sped off into the night. My heart was pounding in my chest like a drum, and all I could do was pray that I was making the right call. If I was wrong, I might end up in jail, but if I was right, then I was fleeing from something far more dangerous than a traffic ticket. The thought of being correct, of this man truly impersonating an officer, sent chills down my spine. It was a nightmare scenario, and I was living it. I kept my car at the speed limit, not wanting to give him any reason to escalate the situation further. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and sure enough, the vehicle was still behind me, its red and white lights flashing as it gained on me. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to think of what to do. The only idea that came to me was to call 911. With shaking fingers, I dialed. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm, steady, and for the first time in those terrifying moments, I felt a sliver of reassurance. "I am being followed by someone pretending to be a police officer," I blurted out, my voice trembling. "He will not give me his badge number, his car is unmarked with no blue lights, and his uniform does not say, police anywhere." The dispatcher asked for my location and more details about what was happening. I explained everything as best I could, describing the man, his car, and the fact that he was chasing me. She listened carefully and then told me the closest safe place to go, the Fraser Winter Park Police Department. Head there now, she instructed. I will send an officer to meet you. I stayed on the line, focused on getting to the station. The car behind me kept up the chase, his lights flashing as if he was trying to intimidate me into stopping. I refused to pull over, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead. Then, just as I was nearing an intersection, the vehicle suddenly turned off its lights and veered right, disappearing down another street. The instant he vanished from view, relief and fear crashed over me like a wave. I was right, he was a fake. But that realization was as terrifying as it was validating. I kept going, determined to reach the police station. When I pulled into the parking lot, I spotted a uniformed officer sitting in his patrol car. He stepped out as I approached, and it seemed like he already knew I was the person he had been waiting for. I parked and got out, still shaking, and told him everything. I described the man's face, his car, the vest he wore, and even the intersection where he had turned off. The officer took it all down, including my contact information, likely in case they needed me to identify the suspect later. He reassured me that I had done the right thing by trusting my instincts and not stopping for someone who seemed suspicious. After a few minutes of talking, he let me go, telling me they would investigate further. As I drove away, my mind raced with thoughts of what might have happened if I had stepped out of my car that night. The possibilities were too frightening to dwell on for long. All I knew was that trusting my gut had likely saved me from something far worse than a traffic ticket. I was grateful to be heading home in one piece. Story 3. I am 29 years old and live on my own in a small house tucked away in a quiet town in Michigan. On weekends, I retreat here to get away from the city life I grew up in, a lifestyle I am honestly burnt out on. Out here, it is peaceful. I love the slower pace of rural life, but I have to admit, my property looks like the perfect setting for a low-budget horror movie. It is a decent-sized house on a large piece of land, and my nearest neighbors are not right next door. It is the kind of place where, if something strange happened, you might not get help right away. Still, it is quiet, and crime is rare around here, probably because the town's population is so small. I do not have a lot of friends in the area, but that is not why I come here anyway. This is my escape, a place to recharge away from work stress and the noise of people. One Friday evening, after a long drive, I had just settled in when there was a knock at the door. I was not expecting anyone, so I was a little surprised. I opened it to see a man standing there with a clipboard in hand. Immediately, I pegged him as a salesman. He introduced himself and asked if I was satisfied with my current security system. I told him I did not have one and was not really interested, adding a sarcastic joke about how no one would bother breaking into my shabby house. Instead of laughing, he launched into his pitch, talking about recent break-ins in the area. That was news to me. I had not heard anything about it. He then asked me who lived with me, and I casually mentioned I lived alone. The guy was persistent, though. He suggested I at least give him my phone number so he could follow up in a couple of weeks, promising to waive the installation fee. The offer sounded decent enough, so I shrugged and gave him my number just to get him off my porch. He thanked me and left, and I went back inside to start dinner. Afterward, I settled onto the couch and got lost in a binge session of Yellowstone. Hours passed, and by the time the clock struck 11, I was still glued to the screen. Then, I heard a knock at the door. It was late, too late for anyone to come by unannounced, especially in a place like this. I do not know my neighbors that well, but it seemed unlikely to be one of them. I decided to ignore it, focusing on my show instead. The knocking continued. I stayed put, determined not to answer. When it happened a third time, though, I felt a twinge of unease. Whoever it was clearly was not planning to leave. I got up and cautiously approached the door, calling out, "Who is it?" No answer. At that moment, my imagination ran wild. It felt like the beginning of one of those horror stories you hear about. I was not about to open the door to find out who, or what, was out there. Through the door, I called, "I am not interested, and I have a gun. Do not make me use it." Truthfully, I do not own a gun, but it felt like the right thing to say to scare off whoever was outside. The knocking stopped after that, and I breathed a small sigh of relief as I returned to the couch. But the relief did not last long. My cell phone rang, and the caller identification displayed 911 Emergency Services. That stopped me in my tracks. I had never gotten a call from 911 before and did not even know they could call you. I assumed it would usually come up as unknown caller or something like that. Curious and a little alarmed, I picked up. A man's voice on the other end asked, "Is this George?" I replied cautiously, "Yes." He then claimed to be with the police department and said they had officers outside my house because of a reported crime in the area. He added that they needed to ask me some questions. Something about the call felt off. I asked the man to have the officers step up to my window so I could confirm their presence. He refused, saying they could not do that, which made no sense to me. My gut was screaming that this was not legitimate. I calmly told him, "Sorry, I do not answer questions at the door," and hung up. Even if it had been the real police, I knew I was not legally obligated to open the door or talk to them. But everything about this situation felt like a setup, a trap, plain and simple. The calls did not stop. That same fake 911 number tried ringing me again, but I ignored it and switched my phone to Do Not Disturb mode. At this point, my nerves were shot, and I decided to call the real 911 to confirm whether the earlier calls were legitimate. The actual dispatcher immediately told me it was a scam. When I explained someone had been at my door earlier and was now trying to intimidate me, she grew serious. She advised me to lock every door and window, find something to defend myself with, and stay put until an officer arrived. While I was still on the phone with the dispatcher, I heard something that made my stomach drop. The doorknob on my back door was rattling. Someone was trying to open it. My heart started racing. Before I could say anything, the rattling turned into loud, violent bangs. Whoever it was had resorted to ramming or kicking the door. I told the operator what was happening, and she assured me the police were on their way and would be there in less than 10 minutes. That was good to hear, but I needed help immediately. Desperate, I shouted toward the back door, "Do you want to get blown to bits?" I was hoping to scare them off. Instead, I heard a voice yell back, "It is the police. Open the door." That was followed by another heavy slam against the door. My back door has a window nearby, unlike the front. I cautiously peeked out, and what I saw confirmed every fear I had. Two men in masks were at the door. Not ski masks or anything typical, these were terrifying, crudely made sacks with holes cut out for their eyes and mouths. They looked straight at me, and I could tell they noticed I was on the phone. That must have tipped them off that the real police were involved because, without hesitation, they bolted into the night. 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. This time, it was actually the police. Relieved but still shaken, I let them in. One of the officers was particularly thorough and insisted on searching my entire property, which I appreciated. With their squad cars parked out front and their lights flashing for about half an hour, it felt like a giant "stay away" sign for anyone thinking of coming back. Even after the officers left, one of the police cars stayed parked outside my house for hours, which gave me some peace of mind. I am not sure exactly when they finally left, but I do know one thing: I am done answering the door for anyone who shows up unannounced. Looking back, I am almost certain the so-called security system salesman was part of this setup. He was probably just scoping out houses, trying to figure out which ones would make the easiest targets. The fake 911 calls were the kicker, an elaborate way to trick people into opening their doors at odd hours. It was chilling to realize how far these people went. Out of curiosity, I went to ask my closest neighbors if the man had come to their doors too. To my surprise, they all said no. For whatever reason, my house was the only one on the street targeted. Maybe I was their first try, or maybe something about me made them think I would be an easy mark. Either way, I learned a hard lesson that night: trust your instincts, and never let your guard down.